Surah Baqarah, verse 258, Allah says, "Have you not considered the one who argued with Ibrahim about his Lord merely because Allah had given him kingship? When Ibrahim said, 'My Lord is the one who gives life and causes death,' he said, 'I give life and cause death.' Ibrahim said, 'Indeed, Allah brings up the sun from the east, so bring it up from the west.' So the disbeliever was overwhelmed, and Allah does not guide the wrongdoing people." Now, as mentioned in the previous episode, when Ibrahim a.s. smashed the idols, he was taken to the king Nimrod and publicly tried in front of all of the people. There he was able to logically prove that statues cannot be given a godlike status because they're not able to do anything. How can they protect and provide for their worshippers when they cannot even protect and provide for themselves? So when Ibrahim a.s. told the ministers to ask the greatest idol who seemed to be holding the axe, the ministers were humiliated because through this demonstration, they realized how foolish they appeared in the eyes of the nation. Now, of course, at this moment, the king who had been present and watching everything, he now chooses to respond by arguing with Ibrahim a.s. about Allah. So Nimrod, just like the Pharaoh, believed in many idols, but he also believed that he himself was a god. So when Ibrahim a.s. had successfully proved to the entire nation how weak and useless the idols were, Nimrod intervened to prove that he was God given his powers and wealth. In other words, this was Nimrod's last attempt to save face in front of his entire nation, who had started questioning why indeed they were worshipping such powerless gods. Now, of course, to challenge his claim to being a god, Ibrahim a.s. had to use a different strategy. Nimrod was not a statue like the rest of the idols. So Ibrahim a.s. could not just smash him to prove how powerless he was. So with the guidance of Allah, Ibrahim a.s. used intellect and wisdom to challenge the king in a way that proved how truly powerless he was in comparison to the Almighty. So while Ibrahim a.s. believed that Allah was the one who gives life and death, Nimrod responded by arguing that he was the one who gives life and death. And as you can see in the verse, at that stage, Ibrahim a.s. does not continue with this argument because he understands that this is something he cannot prove. That's why you don't see Ibrahim a.s. responding back to the king by saying, "No, it is only the Almighty who gives life and death. It's not you." He doesn't continue on with this line of reasoning because he understands he cannot prove it. For example, if Nimrod decides to kill someone on the spot, Nimrod would argue that he just gave that person death. It would be impossible for Ibrahim a.s. to prove that the person only died because Allah had destined his death at that time and place. In other words, he died because Allah willed it. This is something Ibrahim a.s. cannot prove to the king, and he cannot prove to the nation, because as far as the nation is concerned, they just saw Nimrod killing a person. Similarly, if Nimrod chooses to spare someone's life and to not kill him, then of course he will argue that he has just given that person life. Again, it would be impossible for Ibrahim a.s. to prove to Nimrod and to the nation that it was Allah who decided to spare that person. It was Allah who decided to give that person life because that person's death had not yet been destined. So instead of continuing on with this useless debate, Ibrahim switches the conversation towards something that he can prove. He informs the king that Allah causes the sun to rise from the east every day. Now, Ibrahim does not stop there, because he knows that if he does stop there, Nimrod will naturally respond by saying that he was the one who was causing the sun to rise from the east. And of course, yet again, there would be no way to prove who is right and who is wrong, unless there is a challenge that is being given. So Ibrahim a.s. tells the king to make the sun rise from the west. In other words, if he truly believes that he is a god who is in control of everything, then being a god, he should make the sun rise from the west. Now that confused the king. And naturally, given that he had no response, that is something that the entire nation saw. So at that very moment, Ibrahim a.s. had not only proved that all of the statues cannot be idols, they cannot be gods, but at the same time, any human, regardless of how much power they might appear to have, they cannot be given the status of God. Because despite their power, they still are nothing in comparison to the Almighty. Now, this entire demonstration proves the power of tabligh. Tabligh is not just about passing the knowledge to someone else. It is equally important to consider how the knowledge is being passed on. Study your target audience. Understand their mindset. Understand their strengths and weaknesses. Understand what they believe, and then shape your argument accordingly. A Muslim will not just be questioned if he passed on the message to others or not. He will also be questioned, how did he pass it on? If you're talking to someone who believes he is extremely intellectual, then use words of wisdom to prove that all knowledge and intellect is only with Allah. If you are talking to someone who considers himself powerful, give him a challenge that will prove that ultimate power is only with Allah. For example, when Musa a.s. was told by Allah to go to the Pharaoh with God's message, he was told to speak softly. But at the same time, there was a need to prove to the Pharaoh his limited powers in comparison to Allah. Given how stubborn the Pharaoh was, Allah sent 7 signs in the form of 7 challenges to the Pharaoh's nation, each one more severe than the previous. And each time the Pharaoh realized how powerless he actually was. In the case of Nimrod, 1 challenge was enough. Now, having proved that no statue, human, or any creation, sun, moon, stars, none of that could possibly be God, everyone in the nation at that point testified in their hearts to a message that made so much sense. That is when the king held council with his ministers, and that is when they decided to kill Ibrahim a.s. by throwing him in the fire, which only resulted in a miracle being shown as the fire cooled and Ibrahim was saved. This is precisely what I mentioned in the previous episodes, that when Allah sends a Rasul to deliver a message to an entire nation, Allah ensures that the message is delivered in such a way that every person in the nation is able to testify in their hearts that the message of Tawheed makes sense. And at the same time, a miracle is shown to further reinforce their belief that this man who is giving the message has to be a prophet of God. At that point, they will then be held accountable whether they choose to follow that prophet or whether they choose to ignore him. In the case of Musa a.s., the Pharaoh and the entire nation witnessed a miracle that took place, and they also heard the message of Musa a.s. during the festival where there was a competition between the sorcerers and Musa a.s. At that point, everyone witnessed the truth and everyone testified in their hearts. In the same way, for the case of Ibrahim a.s., during this entire demonstration which occurred in front of Nimrod, everyone testified to the truth, and a miracle was also shown to reinforce that this is the only path of Islam. Of course, after this incident, the nation of Ibrahim a.s. was given a specified period of time to ponder, reflect, and accept the truth. And once that period of time was over, Ibrahim a.s. was told to leave the nation with the few believers with him because the Azab was coming. And based on Islamic literature and the Old Testament, the only believers saved on that day besides Ibrahim a.s. were his wife Sarah and his nephew Lut. So once again, this actually shows you that when you put all the pieces of the puzzle together and you see the bigger picture, you can understand why Ibrahim a.s. smashed idols. You can understand what the ultimate agenda was. It wasn't just to prove to a group of people that idols cannot be gods. It wasn't just because Ibrahim a.s. was furious with his entire nation worshipping idols, so in anger he decided to destroy all of the idols to prove his point. It was something that he was guided to by Allah, which was part of a larger demonstration that would involve him being presented to the king, having the entire nation witness his trial, and in that trial, with everyone watching, he could then demonstrate the beauty of Tawheed, the uselessness of idols or human beings being considered as gods, and he could reveal a miracle. Assalamu alaikum.